You are listening to a podcast series, Asking Soulful Questions, by Sacred Art of Living. To learn more, visit sacredartofliving.org. Today's podcast is a part of a series called The Question of Belief.
Well, welcome back to our discussion of trusting your doubts with Stephen Koski. Stephen, Richard was telling me a story recently about conversation he had with a young person who said, Jesus is okay, but the church has let me down. What does that bring up for you when you hear something like that?
It brings up, I think the church has let a lot of people down. I think the church in its rigidity, the church with its kind of clinging to even addiction to making sure that you have the answers, not just the answers, but the right answers. The church, I think, being reflective of kind of more of the Christian nationalism, which is, often about, you must have this truth, and it's against people in the LGBTQ plus community. It's often very racist. It's often very kind of exclusive, not very global. All of the things, in my view, that are anti-Jesus, that are the complete opposite of who Jesus was and what Jesus was about. So I'm not surprised that more and more younger generations are saying, the Jesus character, the one who said, love your enemies, the one who washed tired, sore, weary feet, the one who made sure all of those people who were excluded, left out, cast aside, judged. Yeah, you have a place at my table. I want to break bread with you. It's not a surprise to me that the younger generations, I still, that guy's okay. But what I've come to understand the church to be about, that's not okay. That, and not only not okay, it doesn't reflect who I understand Jesus, to be about. So, the church, the way I kind of phrase it is, really the church was intended to be a bridge that it might invite us into a larger, spacious, unitive reality of love. But we put so many rules about who gets to cross the bridge, who doesn't get to cross the bridge. And we put so many pretty things on the bridge that we forgot that the bridge is actually supposed to carry us somewhere. So in many respects, I think many churches have ended up worshiping church instead of following Jesus. And I think if we can stop worshiping church and return to not only following Jesus, but following the heart of who and what Jesus was all about, I really think younger generations are hungry for that. Really hungry to feel like my life has meaning and purpose, and hungry to be engaged with the things that matter to their lives and to the world.
Yeah, well said. We had another person in this podcast series who comes from a Southern Baptist tradition, was reflecting on some of the same phenomenon. And he was talking about the ex-evangelicals, that sort of movement. And then he was talking about this hemorrhaging in mainline Christianity in this country, at least, maybe in other places in North America and Western Europe. And I'll lump into that now Roman Catholic as well as Presbyterian, Methodist, Episcopal, and so forth. And was just commenting on how if you look at the historical roots of any one of those groups, they have their traditions. So any of our traditions have their past, their history, for good and for ill sometimes, the human limitations. And I certainly can talk about that in my own Catholic history. And I'm wondering, as the lead pastor in a Presbyterian church, you undoubtedly were theologized maybe or exposed to Calvinist theology and the roots of Presbyterianism. And what's your reflection on this shift that's taking place away from the mainline churches?
Yeah. Well, in actual fact, if we actually can return to the roots, I mean, the word radical actually comes from the root word root. So actually, if we can return to the radical nature of Presbyterianism, I mean, John Calvin himself preached in the pulpit in Geneva on Sunday morning and was on the city council, the Geneva City Council. So he would show up on Monday morning to the city council and one of the first people to work for child labor laws. So the roots of our faith are actually connecting our faith to the lives that we live and to justice issues. So in some ways, if we can return to that, and the roots of Presbyterianism and Reformed theology is grace. What is grace? Spacious. What is grace? Inclusivity. What is grace? Welcome. What is grace? Reminding all of us that everyone is made in the image of God's goodness. So actually, I think if we can return to those roots, those things connect to younger generations.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I guess, though, I wonder about the reality of the aging and graying of our traditional congregations. How you can't speak for everybody, I realize, but maybe if you have a perspective on that phenomenon.
You know, I really think one of the things we're trying to do is intergenerational. You know, how can we build bridges between generations? Like with our youth, how can we connect those with gray hair with our young people? And we're working right now to look at recruiting those with gray hair to, in some ways, adopt a younger person, and we're encouraging our younger people adopt a grandparent that's not your grandparent. And so imagine if the grandparents in our congregation who may not have grandparents near, imagine if they showed up at your game or at your concert. Imagine if they sent you a birthday card. Imagine if they actually just knew your name. I was listening to another podcast that said the one thing I believe that would transform every church is if every gray-haired person knew the name of every child and young person that was connected to the church, just knew their name. And on a Sunday morning or a weekday, or if they encountered them in a park or at the grocery store, they looked them in the eyes, they called them by their name, and they just simply said, "How great to see you." And I think that's, that's where I think transformation can take place, is with those relationships. You know, less about the theology. Actually, it is about theology, because I think theology is relationship, but just building those relationships and making those connections.
Well, it's so much. I think what you're speaking to that I hear in me is acceptance, right? Like, if you knew that somebody older was accepting you just for who you were, right? What a great gift that is, and I don't know, it just moves in me.
And seeing you. I remember Naomi Tutu, who you brought to First Presbyterian. Vividly to this day, I remember something she said. She said, "To love is to see, and to be loved is to be seen." And so often we don't see children in the church. What we do at First Presbyterian is really encourage to see them. We actually do something where the children are present at the beginning of worship, and they participate in kind of the beginning things. We make sure they participate in the passing of the peace. We do normally kind of a meditative exercise, because I think in this chaotic, noisy, busy, stressful, anxious world, to just be silent together is really, really powerful. And then we have a blessing that we put up on the screen, and we ask everybody in the church to raise their hands, because then across from the sanctuary, we have something called the Wonder Room. And which interestingly used to be our library. So what we're trying to do is transform them from the old Presbyterian grounded in the library to we created a children's space we call the Wonder Room. So we always say, children are always welcome to stay in the worship service. We celebrate you. But they're rather than either or, and and both and there's an opportunity for you across the hall in the wonder room, if you wish, to really explore and be curious about God's love for you. But before they go, we all raise their hands and we say something along the lines of you are light for all the world. That's what Jesus said. He didn't say you could be, you should be, you ought to be, you might be someday maybe you will be. He said you are light for all the world. So we say that to the children. We say, let your light shine. And so those are ways we're trying to kind of affirm them, see them, but also engage those who are present to celebrate them, to encourage them.
No, that's great. I think we can, there's so many creative things happening that we can also learn from experiments that are happening. One of the places here in our community that maybe 3-4 times a year I am invited to speak at is the Unitarian Church. And kind of along the same lines, rather than for young children, religious classes or catechism or Sunday school, they have a religious exploration hour. And where in that tradition, you get to explore aspects of belief and faith that you might never encounter yourself. But the other thing that I've been treated to recently is a congregation where they decided, and this was based on feedback that they got from the congregation, the young people especially, like what turns you off and what do you like?
Right.
And I'd be curious about your take on this, because I really mean this. You are a good preacher. You really are. And that's a gift. And I think for many people, they would gauge their Sunday experience based on the message of the sermon. But in this experiment, based on the feedback they got from people sort of high school age through their 20s, the complaint was, if you can't say it in 3 or 4 minutes, shut up. Could you give us a message? Could you really focus it? And then could you, out of that message, turn that into a creative time where people could share with churn and buzz, and really engage with it so that it's not a top-down kind of experience. And I found that interesting as someone who does enjoy preaching and teaching as well. It would be a big challenge, but I wonder how that maybe strikes you.
Yeah. I wish I could say that wasn't true. And I guess I'd probably look at it both and again. I mean, I think there is something about the art of preaching. I think preaching from a top down, where I'm coming at it, here is what you must believe, or here are the answers. I think that's different than trying to preach in, perhaps, if I dare to say, a Jesus style that's more stories, because I think stories connect to your story, and preach in a style that kind of wonders and leaves you space to explore. That's different, but absolutely there's a place for conversation and engagement and realizing that, I'm not the expert. I'm in this with you. We're journeying together. I want to hear from your wisdom as well. So I think there is the Sunday morning, and we actually, post-COVID the pandemic changed us, and we're still trying to figure out how. We're starting to grow back again, but the first few months after COVID, we were 50% in person of what we were pre-COVID. And so we're still kind of exploring that, but we're seeing a resurgence of young families. And they're enjoying the Sunday morning experience. And they get together once a month. And in that once a month, they take on a topic and they share leadership and they seek to go deep. So I think it's the both and. I think if that wasn't also an option, I'm not sure they would want to stay connected to to the community.
Right. And yeah, I think maybe offering different options, experimenting ourselves. In Northeast Portland, the African American community has a sort of a home-based church called Irvington Covenant Church. And Pastor Henry Greenidge is a friend of ours from many, many years. And, many churches would have the board outside that would tell you the Sunday sermon topic so that you'd see that. That was not my tradition growing up as Catholic, but what he decided to do with that was to post a question the week before that was, I think, a soul-sized question, not an answer, not come here and I'm going to give you the answer to this, but a really head-scratching, what do I really think about that?
Right.
And then he would offer, and he was a brilliant preacher who in that Black church style could get a lot of dialogue going. But there was clearly not a top-down experience. He was orchestrating reaction and experience with the soul-sized question.
Yeah. I also think just this past Sunday, I told the story of the woman caught in adultery. Wondering, by the way, was she really caught in adultery? Because where's the man? And the tradition really was where women were generally used and abused for the purposes of men. So maybe these religious leaders perhaps were just using her in order to get at Jesus. But we talked about the stones, the angry, self-righteous men with stones in their hands. And so as people came in, everyone was handed a stone. And so as I kind of talked about the story, trying to leave room for where are you in the story? And as you're holding the stone, wonder about this. Then at the end of the service, invited people to come forward, those who want to let go of their stone. Or maybe because one of where Jesus writes in the sand, which how amazing how extraordinary, here they are with, frenzy, angry, ready to throw these stones. And Jesus bends over, writes in the sand. Have you seen the movie Saving Private Ryan?
Yeah.
It's that scene where the
thinking of that.
the company is about to really kind of go at each other's throats. And Tom Hanks says, I was a teacher once. And people are like, what? So it's like Jesus invites them to breathe. And so I talked about, I wonder how many stones we wouldn't throw if we took a breath. Wonder how many bombs we wouldn't drop if we took a breath. So then I invited people, let's take a breath together. So, I think, there is 300 people there. So in some ways it's harder to do the small group thing with that larger crowd. But to your point of engagement, not top down, but invite space, enter into the story as opposed to being told what you should think about the story.
Right. Space for grace. And a good open-ended question or soul question would just be, have you ever wondered what he was writing on the ground? Because we don't know.
Yeah.
And, I've heard all the guesses from, he was writing down all the sins of the people one by one who walked away. That would have been a very creative approach to the situation, but it's the open-endedness of it.
Yeah. But I think it's right. I think the old top-down 3 points in a poem, those days are gone. And I'm not unconvinced, even my style of preaching, perhaps the days are numbered and need to continue to adapt. And I keep thinking, go ahead.
I think that interactive piece, that I know that really works for me, especially even if I'm the facilitator of the event, because when I'm like taking questions or somebody shares something, then it raises something in me, right? I hadn't thought about it that way. It becomes so much more, we're all teaching each other, right? It's not, I've got the answer. It's kind of like what we started with. It's not like I've got the answer, but can we all explore it together?
I mean, imagine if we approach the Bible as the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of a conversation. So many people approach the Bible that it's about finding the answer, and once you find the answer, it's the end of the conversation. Imagine if we actually gave each other permission to wrestle with the Bible, to argue with the Bible, to disagree with the Bible. The depth of conversations that would happen if we had that kind of permission to do that, I think would lead, as I say, to deeper conversations and a more authentic faith, rather than the faith that I give you because here's the answer.
And I think maybe the key there in what you just said is giving permission, because I think for people who came from traditional religious backgrounds, the pastor who gives that permission, who opens that up, is doing a great service. Yeah. And I think that would also be a key to the younger generations. I think they would sense the way that you really care about how I react to this. So
I think that's huge, Richard. I remember growing up in the church, and I really had, at a young age, a real sense of, man, there's a lot of stuff that I'm hearing that doesn't square up with me, not with my experience of God. What you're telling me, it doesn't square up. But there were adults in that setting that just allowed me to be that way, without judgment, and it was so freeing.
Yeah, I think I just think that invitation, and the word that just comes to mind as I'm listening to you is vulnerability. As opposed to the pastor who's has it all together, has all the answers, and is up there, invulnerable to some degree. I often say it's not our strengths that unite us. It's not our strengths that connect us. It's our vulnerability. I mean, what we share most in common are the salty taste of our own tears. I mean, what we all know is loss, what we all know is heartbreak. But we put on our armor. And I think I was saying in a group this morning, I lead a poetry Zoom group as a Lenten devotion. And I was saying this morning that I talk to so many people who say, I can't come to worship right now because I'll fall apart. I know I'll cry. And I think, how sad is that? I mean, we put Kleenex boxes at the end of the pew to give you permission. This is the place where your tears are a gift. Your tears are welcome. This is the place that if you can't pray, I get that. So let us pray for you. If you can't find the words to sing, I get that. We've all been there. So let us sing around you until you can find the words again, because I guarantee you, I'm going to be at a place in my life where I can't sing. And I'm going to then have to depend on you, to sing and to hold me. So I think it's also, if churches can be more of a vulnerable place where we cannot be authentic, and I think that's what younger generations are looking for as well, is authenticity. Is this place real?
Yes.
Can I be myself here? No, absolutely. And I think, again, the key word in what you were just sharing to me was vulnerability. And I've been enough around preaching and the art of preaching to know that sometimes a preacher will use a personal story as an illustration, but it comes across sometimes maybe as a bit manipulated. Like, well, when I was not enlightened, once upon a time, I had a little fight with my teenage daughter, whatever. And I think the vulnerability that, which is the authenticity, is when I can reveal that there are still questions today that I'm wrestling with. Yeah. I'm still in a dark night place around something. Yeah. And that's a little scary to be that self-revealing, but I think that opens up as well a trust.
Yeah, I always say, never make yourself the hero of the story. No. Yeah, that's not going to connect you. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, I shared that, I really believe that after the pandemic, we were in such a hurry to move on that we forgot to heal. We were in such a hurry to move on that we forgot to face our collective grief and trauma. And as a result, anxiety and depression are the norm. Loneliness is being called an epidemic. Gun violence, road rage, bullying, all of these things, as Richard Rohr would say, pain that's not transformed just keeps getting transmitted. And I love what Parker Palmer said, where violence is what happens inwardly or outwardly when you don't know what else to do with your suffering. And so I shared that I'm hurting. I mean, I shared, and I mean it honestly, that I've been in ministry for 36 years. I started when I was 10, if you're doing the math. But I've been in ministry for 36 years, and these last 5, by far, have been the hardest. And I have so many colleagues who either are leaving or have left the ministry. And I just shared, I'm hurting. I don't know if you know the story about where the Hebrew people would travel to Jerusalem, to the Temple Mount, and they would ascend the steps. This would be their pilgrimage, and they would enter the gates, and they would turn to the right, and they would circle the perimeter of the courtyard, unless you were heartbroken, unless you were shattered in some way. You would still make the pilgrimage. You would ascend the steps, you would enter the gate, but you would turn to the left. And it was the obligation of those who turned to the right, when they encountered the person coming from the left, to stop and to say, what happened to you? And to listen to the story. And then it was the obligation to offer a blessing.
Beautiful.
And the idea was the journey to healing for both, the journey for healing for those who turn to the right, was to see the suffering and the pain in those who turn to the left, and to somehow be a blessing in the midst of that. And the journey for healing for those to the left was to put down the armor and to allow yourself to be vulnerable. Think of the vulnerability of going against the grain, going against the current and actually turning to the left. And what I said, it's in that place of mutual pain. That's where God meets us. So I said in church, I said, well, let's stop pretending that everything's okay, because it's not. And I said, I'm not okay, and I need help. So let's stop pretending, and let's meet each other in our places of pain. And for me, it was really, I'm in a difficult season in my life right now. And so it was coming from a place of honesty. I had someone say to me, and I just didn't expect this, where she said, I just didn't expect a 60-year-old white male to say in front of all of us that you need help. And that, to me, that made me really sad. I understood the truth of that, but the fact that it came as such a shock says something about our society, I think.
That kind of transparency, I think, is the invitation then to own and not be embarrassed by, or I think we are corporately. It's not just in ministry. I think all the helping professions in post-COVID, the school teachers, the nurses are experiencing that same. We just tried to get right back at things, and had an experience just a couple of weeks ago. I went in for my annual exam, and I've got a great doc who's kind of a coach. And he said, so 73, yes. He said, at first it just shocked me. He says, there's a brand new study that came out in January that the life expectancy of the average American male has fallen 5 years over the last decade. I was shocked that he says, you're actually 73.2 now is the average white male life expectancy. And I just gasped. Because I thought, well, Buster, you're right there now. And of course, a lot of it was COVID related. But I've wondered too, I mean, sometimes hard science, that kind of piece of information is worth sharing because it stops us in our tracks and makes us realize, wait a minute, corporately, we've all been impacted by this. And so I don't want to just accept that as a piece of statistic. I want to, first of all, claim that, know that, and then make it a challenge to myself. So what am I going to do not to just fall prey to that?
Yeah. So I imagine, I mean, kind of coming back to where we began, rather than having a place of certainty, a place of answers, a place where you really, unless you have it all together, you're not really welcome. Imagine if instead we had space for our pain, space for our questions, space for our wrestling, space for our humanness, and then somehow God's in the midst of that, as opposed to God being in the box that's neatly tied with a nice ribbon that has all of the answers.
Right on. Yeah, very good.
Yeah, I was thinking, Stephen, your story, it really pointed out to me leadership when that woman said about a 60-year-old white male, Richard, he knows I got a lot of issues with this, another old white guy trying to, be the leader. And it's obviously not the gender or the race, but it is that lack of vulnerability that just doesn't ring true with me. And I don't know why it does for a lot of people. It's like, I want a guy that's up there, that's real, that's honest, that's, like Richard said, authentic. And I don't know why people want the BS version of that, right? Why do you want somebody lying to you?
Yeah. I was at a memorial service of a dear friend whose death was unexpected and tragic. And I wasn't up front. I was in the pews as a mourner. And the first words out of the pastor's mouth were, there should be no tears today. Your loved one is in a better place. It took everything, every fiber of my being to not stand up and just shout, no, 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 cry, weep, scream, laugh. It all belongs. It all belongs. And somehow, the shortest sentence in the Bible, Jesus wept, reminding us that vulnerability, the tears belong.
Yeah, and that's a missed opportunity, isn't it? Because you have a group of people there who are corporately in grief, and that kind of platitude flows out of the same tradition of using the Bible as an answer book, catechism. So here it is. Don't snuff out your feelings, and exactly, it's. I just, as you were saying, the shortest sentence in the Bible, that was one of my favorite lines. Yeah. Jesus wept, and what's it like? The rabbis used to talk about God weeping with us. And in the Holocaust, that if that wasn't a possibility, then there was no God to believe in. That somehow there had to be something larger that held and resonated, just like a tuning fork with our suffering.
I couldn't help but think of the people present, because I guess I was feeling it. Because the next song, the song that we sang first, was "Our God is an awesome God." And I'm thinking, what about the people sitting in these pews? Because this was an unexpected, tragic death. I'm thinking it. So I was assuming that a whole lot of other people thinking that my God's not so awesome right now. And I think a healthy spirituality is a really honest one. And as you said, a missed opportunity, that sanctuary, that service was not a container that was safe, to be honest. And what a gift it can be if we can provide a container in our faith where you don't have to pretend, where you actually can be really honest, emotionally and spiritually.
And the thing is, it's there in the tradition too, because you could have started that same sermon with Job, God, this sucks.
Yeah.
And that would have really been okay. because there's plenty of psalm passages you could have been pulled on and so forth.
Yeah.
And that would have been to have resonated and met people where they were at energetically, instead of coming and imposing a conclusion.
Yeah. I often think of that image of the challenge is to hold your grief in one hand and hold your gratitude in the other hand, and to allow both to stretch your heart. Because if we squeeze too tightly to our grief, we will fall into despair.
Mm-hmm.
If we squeeze too tightly to our gratitude, our faith just becomes saccharine Pollyanna platitudes. But to allow both the grief and the gratitude to speak to each other, and to allow both to expand our hearts. That beautiful thing, again, Parker Palmer says, rather than your heart being broken apart because it's rigid into 1,000 shards fallen on the floor, keep your heart supple so that it can break open. And if your heart breaks open, there's greater capacity to love and to hold the suffering of others. And I just think that's such a beautiful image.
It is. So it feels like grata-grief.
Yeah.
That we have to invent a term that can sort of hold both together at the same time.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Stephen. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, real gift. Thank you.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Yeah, Daryl.
Wow. Yeah. What a great conversation. And Stephen, thank you so much for sharing with us today. I hope all of you that have either watched or listened to this podcast have been touched by this conversation, and hope that you'll come back and listen to more soul-sized questions.
We would like to thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Question of Belief. For more information about our entire podcast library, Asking Soulful Questions, visit our website at sacredartofliving.org.